All right, on to lecture 4. This will be a relatively short lecture, and it just covers how to make functions. So code organization becomes important. So the more and more you write code, the more and more you write scripts, you come to realize how important organization is for understanding your code and then reusing it. So one of the most important ways to organize your code is by being able to write scripts and create functions. So we saw a little bit before how to create a function, how to create a script. So again, you want to open your text editor. Sublime is what I use. You can use Sublime, or if there's one that you prefer, and you have to save it as a name. So here I am going to save it in my home directory, and I will call it function examples.py. All right, so now I have my script saved and I've used the .py extension, and that's important because it helps us color code different parts of the script based upon Python's syntax. So we discussed before that Python has a certain syntax that it expects. This code editor is able to recognize that syntax, and it actually really helps you write code without having bugs or kind of text minor mistakes in it. And hopefully you'll see that as you go along. All right, so we've talked before, if you have a function, you can do something like get input from a user. And so the way you use that is you use the input function. So there's a built-in function called input, and it takes in a string that is printed out to let the user know what exactly you want. So give me a number. All right, and then after that, we are going to print this. And we shall see if it works. So Python 3 function example. So the way you run this script is that you do it like this, function 3. So we give it Python 3, and then the name of the script you want to run. So give me a number, 56. Okay, so did I save this? Let me try this again. All right, so now it runs the input function, and it asks for a number. We give it a number, and then it stores it as a string, and then we printed this back out. So let's say we wanted to add 2 numbers. So let's do this. So now we can take in 2 different numbers, and now they print both of them out. Okay, so far so good. Now let's say we wanted to add 2 numbers together. So can we do it this way? So we're going to add A and B together, and then we're going to print out, and let's see what happens. All right, so 23, 13. And so what I expect the addition of these 2 numbers is to be 36. But instead what I get is 2313. And so why is that? Well, if you remember, input takes whatever you type and stores it as a string. So if you use the addition operator for 2 strings, what it does is it concatenates them together. So it took the 23 and concatenated it to the 13. So what do we want to do if we want to get the addition, the sum of those 2 numbers? Well, the first thing you have to do is actually convert it into an integer type object. And so we can do this by using the explicit declaration. So we can use the class name to explicitly create an integer object, and we can use whatever is stored in A and whatever is stored in B to do that. So now let's see what happens when we try to run this script. 23, 13, oops, and I forgot to save it, of course. 23, 13, and so now when I do it, it is equal to 36. So let's say I wanted to do this again. So I could just copy it, and I could paste it, and I could run it all over again. 1, 2, prints out 3, 4, 6, and it prints out 10. So now we've run this logic twice. And perhaps I want to do it again, and again, and again. So let's say I want to do it 5 times. So you can see what I'm doing right now is I'm copying and pasting this code kind of over and over and over again. So if someone reads this code, they're going to have to say, like, okay, what is going on here? They're going to have to figure out what exactly is going on here. And then they're going to have to look again. And they're going to have to realize, oh, what they're doing is they're just making an exact copy and paste, and they're running this over and over again. So if we run this script, we're going to find it runs 5 different times. All right, 1 plus 2 equals 3. That's the first time. 2 plus 3 equals 5. That's the second time. 3 plus 4 equals 7. That's the third time. 4 plus 5 equals 9. That's the fourth time. And then 5 plus 6 equals 11. And then it runs. And then let's say I decide, oh, you know what? I want to modify this a little bit. What I really want to do is add a plus b and also divide it by 2. And so, in order to do that, then I have to modify this line right here. Okay, let's do it. And so now I run this code, 2 and 4, and then the output that I get is 3.0. But when I run it again, I'm getting 2 and 4, and now it's giving me 6. And why is that? Well, oh, I forgot I have to modify all of these different lines of code. And so this becomes very difficult to manage your code, because now each time you want to modify it, you have to modify every single time in your script that you've tried to do this sort of logic. So this kind of justifies why you want to use functions. So what are functions? So functions are a way to do something over and over and over again, where every single time you want it to do it exactly the same. So whenever we run print, we want to, the logic of the print function is always the same. Whenever we run dir, the logic of that is all the same. So there's certain functions that you end up wanting to do over and over and over again. So you can also create custom functions. And so the syntax for that is that you have to use this keyword. So this keyword tells Python that what you're doing is you're defining a function. So we're creating a brand new function. And you can name it whatever you want. So after def is the name of the function that you want. And let's call this add 2 numbers. So we're pretty free to call this whatever we want. But it has to be a single word. So we can't have spaces in there, for example. So we can't call it like add 2 numbers, because it just becomes too confusing. The syntax becomes too confusing for Python to parse and realize, oh, this is the name of the function and there's spaces. So we typically put underscores where we would want to have spaces. All right, so we've named the function, and then now all we have to do is indicate how many arguments that it takes. So we've seen before functions takes arguments. So if we want to use the type, there's an error, and because type requires one or 3 arguments, and typically the way we use it is we only give it 1 argument. So if we supplied an argument, now it works just fine. So when we define our function, we also have to say how many arguments it needs. So one way to do that is, so the way that we do that is we give names to the arguments that that the user has to enter. So we're going to call this number 1, and we're going to call this number 2. And then at the end, you use a semicolon. So the colon is used to say that there is going to be another block of code that follows this, and this is where the meat of the program of the function is. So this is how we know exactly what the function does. So this is where we define what the function does. And so one of the things you'll notice is that when I actually hit enter after putting the colon, it automatically indents my cursor. And so you might have seen this before if you've taken Python classes, but the way Python works is that it uses indentation as a way to indicate blocks of code. And so all of the part of, so we have to tell the script, like, this is what the function does. You know, start function here, end function here. And so there's really a number of ways that you can accomplish this. For example, in C++, if you ever coded in C++, you would use these open and closed brackets, and everything that fell between the open and closed brackets would be part of the function. That's just not how Python works. What Python does is it uses a colon in order to indicate, okay, now we're going to have a block of code, and it's all going to be indented at the same place. So all of this needs to be indented one tab over. So we are going to do, so let's have multiple lines just to make it a little bit longer. So one of the things we're going to do is we're going to make sure that the number is a integer. So if we accidentally send it a string, it's able to convert that into an integer, and then it stores it as num1. And then we do the logic. So number 3, or let's call it outnum equals num1 plus num2. And then we use this return keyword to specify what we want the function to return. And so you'll notice that all of these are tabbed, and now when we run this code, we can run something like this. So we'll ask for 2 numbers again, and then we will just simply do this. Now let's see if this works. So 2 plus 6, and the answer is 8. So it was able to output 2 plus 6, and it did everything right. All right, so how did this code run? What did the Python interpreter do when it read this script? So the first thing it did is it read this block of code, and it said, okay, the user first is going to create the definition of a function, and it is going to be called add 2 numbers. And so this doesn't actually run anything. So let's say we didn't have any of this code right here. Let's say we didn't have any of this code right here, and we tried to run this script. So nothing would happen, because all we did right here was define what the function was. But now that we've defined it, we can actually try to run it. So let's say I just try to do something like this. What happens? All right, so nothing happened. So what happens if we try to print this? So basically what this is right here, this tells us that, okay, there is a function that we created, and this function is called @2numbers, and then this is just kind of the memory location of where that function is defined. So that part is not really important. So if we want to call a function, you have to remember that you always use the open and close parentheses. So now let's see what happens. If we try to call it, we get an error. And why do we get an error? We get an error because we didn't call the function correctly. So we specified the function has to be passed 2 different numbers in order to use it. And so because we didn't pass it any arguments, it knows that we use this function incorrectly, and then it returns an error to let us know. And it says you need 2 different positional arguments, and they're called num1 and num2. So let's try this again, and let's try to send it a single number. we're missing 1 because we only added 1. What if we put in 2 numbers? Will it work? Lo and behold, yes, now it runs. Nothing is printed out, but the script is able to run. And so this gets into kind of like one of the key differences between the interpreter and the scripts. So when you run something in the interpreter, it automatically prints something out when it's returned. The script automatically hides this. So if we wanted to print out the result, we would either have to do something like this, and this would say whatever this function returns, print out. And so now when we try to do it, it returned 4, so it took 1 and 3 and added 4 and then printed it out. So you either would have to print it, or you would have to capture it by assigning it to a variable. And then once you assign it to a variable, again, you can print it out. So this is where the print statement starts to become really important, because if you want your script to print stuff out to the standard out, that's kind of what you have to do. What happens if I give it 3 numbers? 1, 3, 7. What happens then? I get another error. And it says this function takes 2 arguments, but 3 were given, so I didn't use it correctly. So far so good. And so now if we want to make it take input from the user, so again, we have to get 2 numbers from the user. So A equals input, give me a number, and then B equals input, give me a number. And now we can pass those to the function. Give me a number, 34, 11. And so we pass these to the function, but then I forgot to print it out. So let's run this one more time, 34, 11, and so now it's equal to 45. If I wanted to do it again, now I only have to copy and paste this part of the code. Okay. There's no reason I can't simply just put all of this logic into the function. And so, one way we could do this is if we can modify it so it doesn't take any arguments, and then we can add this part to the code, and we can also print out the answer. And so let's see what we've done. So now we have our function. It's called add 2 numbers. Now we specify that there are no parameters that we need to pass it. It takes in 2 numbers. It queries the user to give it 2 numbers. So now we also have to name these things correctly. So A and B. So now that's matched up. It prints it out, and then it returns the number and store it as X. So give me a number, 2, 5, and the answer is 7. So we can run this now 4 times in a row. Give me a number, 13, 22. It added 2 numbers. That's the second time it ran. That's the third time it ran. And now that's the 4th time it ran. And so now it reads a lot easier. We define what this function does, and then we run it 4 times. And it's very obvious that we're just running this function 4 different times. Let's play around a little bit with some of the scripts, some of the strings that we've used. So maybe we want to do something like this. So info. So All right, so let's see if this works. We'll just run it one time to be sure. Give me two numbers separated by a space, 34, 5. It adds it together and equals 39. So how did that work? So we ask it for two numbers separated by a space, and then that was a string. We use the string, the split function, in order to split it. And since we didn't give it an argument, it split it on the white space. And so it created a list that was a list of two different strings. And then we used a list comprehension here in order to convert the strings into integers. And then we set A equal to this first part and B equals to the last part. And so now when we added those numbers together, we print it out and then we return it. Let's see. We could also do this all in one line if you wanted to. So that's one of the nice things about Python, is that you can actually do lots of things without writing a ton of code. And as you get used to kind of thing like list comprehensions, etc., it becomes a lot easier to read them. So 4 plus 6 divided equals 10. And so what we did is we said, okay, store this information in data. Okay. We split data. And so by running the split, we create a list. And then we use a list comprehension to take every element in it and convert it into an integer. And then a list would have been returned. So what would have been returned by this looks something like this, 4-6. But we can also rename the list into individual elements by putting a comma there. If you have the same number of variable names as elements in the list, then everything will be fine. But if you don't, so for example, if I did something like this, I'm going to get an error. So it says value error, not enough values to unpacked. So this is the line of the code that's problematic. And it expected to get 3 different elements of the list because I said A, B, and C. So there's 2 commas and 3 different variable names, but only two were given. So it only would have sent it 3 and 2. So might be a little bit weird, but as you code more and more and more, just get used to like actually trying to write things in this way. You might forget to return the number. You might forget to specify what exactly you want the function to return. So, let's see. Let's see how this works. So now instead of printing it, we're going to print whatever x is. So x is equal to whatever the function returns. And so 2, 3. All right, 5 is printed out. But let's say we forgot to return. So basically all of this is going to run, and then instead of 6, you get this weird value called none. And so what none is kind of like the null value of Python. And so because we forgot to return a value, this value is actually equal to none. So if we don't specify what is returned, the none value is returned. And so now x is set to none, and when we print it, that's what we get printed out. The return statement, you can return whatever you feel like. You could return A. So if I did it that way, 2 and 6, instead of 8 being returned, that 2 is returned because that's the number that's returned. We can do it fixed. We can return 5. And so when we run it, we give it the numbers 1 and 8, but what actually gets returned to x is the 5. So that return statement is actually very important because it's what specifies exactly what you want to have returned. So 2 plus 6, and now that number, that is what is returned. All right, so the first part of this lecture is over. So remember, to define a function, you need this def keyword. So that's what tells Python you're about to create a function. You need the name of the function, and it has to be a single word. You can't have any spaces in it. You have to have the parentheses, and within these parentheses, you specify how many parameters you want. And then you also need a semicolon, and so that indicates that you're about to begin the code that you want the function to run. All of the code that the function runs has to be indented. So all of these are indented by a single tab. And so what's nice about using something like Sublime Text is that it automatically tabulates everything and automatically. So it kind of puts you in the right spot. Once you are done with the function, you have to return to your original tabulation. So now there's no spaces in order to get back to normal. So this is how we define the function. So this is the code in the function that it runs, and then this is the name and the parameters that it accepts, and then this is what it returns is specified by that return keyword.